Today's webinar is focused on the World Energy Outlook Report. Before we begin, I'll quickly go over some of the webinar features. For audio, you have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over your telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers options in the audio pane. If you choose to dial in by phone, please select the telephone option, and a box on the right side will display the telephone number and audio pin you should use to dial in. If anyone is having technical difficulties with the webinar, you may contact the GoToWebinars help desk at 1-888-259-3826 for assistance. If you would like to ask questions, we ask that you use the questions pane where you may type in your question. Also, the recording of today's web presentation will be added to YouTube at the link provided on this slide. Today's webinar agenda is centered around a presentation and panel discussion from our expert speakers on the 2018 World Energy Outlook Report. Before we launch into the presentation, Giulia Visconti from the Department of Energy will give an introduction and overview of the NICE Nuclear Innovation Clean Energy Future Initiative. I will then provide a brief introduction of today's experts. Then, following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session where the panelists will address questions submitted by the audience. Giving an overview for today's webinar is Giulia Visconti, who is a senior advisor with the Office of Nuclear Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy and lead country's team member for the NICE Future Initiative. Giulia, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. As Jordan said, I'm Giulia Visconti from the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy, and one of the members of the NICE Future team. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the NICE Future Initiative lead countries team, United States, Canada, and Japan, and our participant countries, Argentina, Poland, Romania, Russia, UAE, and the United Kingdom. This Clean Energy Ministerial, or CEM, initiative is still new. The NICE Future Initiative was launched in May 2018 in Copenhagen in the presence of ministers. The initiative is off to a strong start and puts for the first time the spotlight at CEM on nuclear and clean energy systems. The dialogue of the initiative is ongoing year-round, but we are excited CEM will convene our ministers again in Vancouver, Canada in May 2019 to discuss these and other topics. The NICE Future Initiative envisions a world in which innovative nuclear applications and uses advance clean energy goals. The initiative considers the many roles that nuclear energy can play in clean energy systems of the future, including complementing renewable energy. It ensures policymakers have information on the full set of clean energy options. The initiative allows for a focus on full-scale nuclear for baseload electricity, as well as innovative technologies such as small modular reactors and integrated nuclear renewable energy systems that are more flexible. It explores innovative applications of nuclear energy for clean electricity production, remote access, decarbonization of heavy industry, hydrogen production, district heating, water desalination, and more. It's exciting, it's new, and it's visionary, and it is at the ministerial level globally. The NICE Future Initiative is delighted to host today's webinar. To those who are listening, we want to hear your ideas and suggestions and welcome you to send them to us at jordan.cox@nrel.gov. If you like today's webinar, please spread the word. We wish to thank today's experts for their willingness to provide key updates on important analyses on the future of nuclear power. As innovation, systems integration, and flexibility are some very important themes of our initiative, we particularly welcome the views of our experts on these topics as they fit into the broader analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giulia, for that introduction. What an exciting initiative. Now, I would like to provide a brief introduction of today's panelists. First up will be Brent Wanner, who is Senior Energy Analyst at the International Energy Agency and the lead of power generation analysis within the World Energy Outlook team. In 2008, he coordinated the World Energy Outlook 2018 special focus on electricity and directed power sector modeling and analysis. Following Brent, we will hear from Dr. Henri Payer, Deputy Director, Division of Nuclear Technology Development and Economics, and the Head Technical Secretariat for the Generation 4 International Forum, and for the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. Presenting with Dr. Payer will be Antonio Valla Sole, the nuclear analyst Division of Nuclear Technology Development and Economics, OECD, Nuclear Energy Agency. And with those brief introductions, I would like to welcome Dr. Pierre. Welcoming Brent.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Jordan. This is Brent Warner from the International Energy Agency. As mentioned, I lead the power generation analysis work for the World Energy Outlook, and today I'd like to discuss. One second, you should be seeing introduction slide there from World Energy Outlook 2018, and so I'd like to take my time to touch on a few things, a few highlights and key elements from the 2018 World Energy Outlook. Kind of put them in four categories. I touch on a little bit of the context for all relevant for nuclear, but some of the broader energy context. A little touching on a few points from our electricity outlook, and a big part of our work this past year was looking at the implications of that outlook, also including on the economics of nuclear power and other power generation technologies. And then finally, I'll close with a bit about the role of policy and what we see going forward, the role of governments in developing and moving forward on a clean energy transition. So first, a few points on context of general overview, but emphasizing electricity, which is the main area where we see nuclear power playing a role. I'll come back to that, of course, with under the initiative, under the NICE initiative and the NICE Futures initiative, we see that also nuclear can play a role in other sectors, but I'll come back to that. Particularly on electricity side, we see that it's increasingly important and central in the modern world. This was part of our motivation for having the first of its kind electricity focus in the World Energy Outlook last year. It was the year of electricity in the IEA, and we as an agency are looking across all technologies, including nuclear power, of course, renewables, also carbon capture, utilization and storage, of course, fossil fuels as well. And so we are, as an agency, and just a word there, we have 30 member countries that are part of the International Energy Agency, plus 8 association countries. That expands our global coverage to close to 80% of global energy demand today, and that contributes to the work we do in the World Energy Outlook. So back to the electricity demand here, or electricity context, we have electricity demand in general has been growing faster than overall primary energy demand, about twice the rate. If you go back to the year 2000, we've seen almost 3% annual growth. And that means today, electricity accounts for about 19% of final consumption of energy, and that's growing. We've seen that investment in the power sector is increasing, actually will outpace that in upstream oil and gas in 2016 and 2017, which is reshaping the importance of electricity in the overall energy dialogue, and with that, all power generation technologies. Of course, we see the rise of solar photovoltaics, PV, and wind power, and this is transforming electricity supply around the world and transforming the outlook for electricity as we know it. Solar PV and wind combined in the last 2 years, in 2016 and 2017, for almost 270 gigawatts of new power plants, and that was more than all fossil fuels combined in the same period. However, not everything is on track. We very much keep tabs on global energy trends here, and one of them, of course, is global CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and where we had several years of stagnant CO2 emissions, actually declines in 2015 and 2016 at a global level. 2017 actually saw an increase in emissions of about 1.6%, and this is a worrying trend in the overall clean energy transition and achieving our overall collective environmental goals, including those under the Paris Agreement. In terms of good news, one point, since we've been tracking it as an agency going back more than 20 years, where we've been tracking energy access issues, the global population without access to electricity fell below 1 billion for the first time since tracking. In the year 2000, this number was 1.7 billion people in the world without access to electricity. A lot of credit goes to India there, but also more to be spread around the world in terms of credit. And this is something that is critical to the continued evolution of the power sector globally, and providing access to these 1 billion people in the coming years. So just a bit of framework for the World Energy Outlook to keep in mind. I will focus most of the highlights on the new policy scenario. We have multiple scenarios in the World Energy Outlook, and the main reason being here that guiding policymakers requires acknowledging that there are uncertainties in the world, and also uncertainties on what the policy directions will be. So we emphasize and have emphasized here two main scenarios: the new policy scenario that takes account of all the current policies and regulations in place, but also those that are being actively discussed that have implementation measures already in the works to change the course of energy future. Now we also have another scenario, sustainable development scenario, that so works in another direction, starts from our collective environmental goals, particularly those on addressing global climate change, mitigating air pollution and the negative health effects that are associated with that, as well as providing energy access to those 1 billion people and growing. That works backwards on how best can we accomplish that. And so we have these two scenarios that help guide policymakers on the future, and certainly relate to the outlook for nuclear power. For this year, in the electricity focus, we also introduced another scenario looking at an expanded role for electricity, and I'll say a bit more about that. So kind of going, we're a quantitative agency. The World Energy Outlook is a numbers book first. Some important context is the weight, the geography of energy and the changing geography of energy. Just a point to highlight here, if we go back to the year 2000, and now we're moving forward to today, or 2017, the latest data we have, we see a very stark change in the roles of different countries and regions, particularly China becoming far and away the largest energy consumer. In the year 2000, the United States and European Union were the two largest, and this has changed dramatically over the course of the last 2 decades. Now, if we look forward, we see further changes here. Broadly, China continues to grow, yes, but we also see strong growth in India, in Africa, in the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. So in developing economies, very strong energy demand growth. And of course, this impacts the weight in the overall geopolitics of energy, also the weight of decisions being made in the capitals of these countries. Now, it should be noted, it's not necessarily a good thing of consuming more energy here. The European Union, while moving down here, 5th on the list by 2040, that's thanks in part to very successful energy efficiency policies and efforts. And you see the United States more or less stayed constant over time, even though economic growth is projected as well. So, but this changes the picture and the general geography of energy, which is an important piece of information starting for context here. So we turn a bit to the electricity side and the electricity outlook in particular. I wanted to highlight a couple key trends. One, fossil fuels have been a central part of the power sector since its inception, and we see a continued role under current and proposed policies. This is coal capacity, so we're showing overall installed capacity globally here. We see actually coal capacity plateauing, and that's largely due to a slowdown of development in China and India on the coal side, looking to reduce the development of new coal-fired power plants, which changes the trajectory of what we've seen even in the last 10 years. Gas continues to be a very important part of the power sector and actually becomes the largest single source of capacity going forward. in terms of low carbon sources, hydropower and nuclear are the largest low carbon sources today, globally, and we do see continued growth for both. Particularly on the nuclear the line here we see for nuclear capacity looks quite stable, but this hides a geographic shift, which I'll say a bit more about. The hydropower development is mainly in China and Latin America and a bit in Africa, less so in advanced economies. But where do we see most of the growth in terms of capacity is coming from solar PV and wind. This is what I touched on. These changes that are coming, we see a dramatic expansion of the role for solar PV and wind going forward. This means that about 70% of investment in new power plants goes to solar PV and wind under current and proposed policies. That's 2 out of every 3 gigawatts built in the future to 2040 is solar PV and wind. So it's already playing a massive role, a central role in our new policy scenario. To round out, we also see growth for other renewables. And of course, we're seeing an expanding role for storage. And we've highlighted battery storage here, expanding from a very low base, moving up to several hundred gigawatts, and with the potential to grow further, depending on the costs that we see going forward. I mentioned the flat line for nuclear capacity is slightly increasing, but there's hiding a very much a geographic split. On the one hand, we have advanced economies with large fleets of nuclear power plants that are now aging in the United States and Europe. These fleets are approaching 40 years of age on average. And so the main question is what happens to those nuclear fleets in the near term, and then of course, looking in the longer term, will new projects be able to be developed, whether they are large, whether they're small and modular and more flexible. I think that we've treated that in a bit separate questions here, but the first question is really about what happens to the existing fleet. For example, if we take into account of just the lifetime extensions that are in place today that have been granted, and we look forward and account for the projects that are under construction, the role of nuclear is set to decline substantially in these regions. In the United States, Europe, and Japan, falling closer to 5% of generation, down from 20% on average in advanced economies today. So this is a major question both for environmental, for CO2 emissions, for pollutant emissions, but also for security. On the other hand, there are markets that are growing, led by China. India also has plans for expansion. Russia looks to continue its heavy use dependence on nuclear power. But you see 2 speeds in 2 directions for nuclear power today. And certainly, this is a change from about now getting close to a decade ago, when there were discussions of the nuclear renaissance. Now we're seeing quite a different picture here. So I'll try to go quickly. I'm aware of the time, but I want to touch on a few points. Generally, this capacity expansion that I mentioned with wind and solar, we're seeing that changing the mix quite substantially. Globally, it means that solar and wind go from about 6% of generation in 2017 to 20% of generation in 2040. That helps reduce the share of fossil fuels, but you still have fossil fuels at about 50% of generation. And as nuclear, the capacity expands slightly, its overall share of generation stays relatively constant at about 10% globally. But that change of wind and solar is really the key. Going to 20% of generation has massive implications for the power sector overall. And this is some of what we explored in the electricity focus. And it changes not only the economics and the operations side it changes it both at the market level and a bit on the individual economics for power plants. I want to make a point on both of those levels. First, why is that changing? Because it's requiring more flexibility in the system. If we look at the share of wind and solar here, and in India, China, and the United States, it's well below 10% today. And that means it's at a lower phase of integration. We worked hard within our agency with our system integration unit looking at the challenges and opportunities of integrating increasing shares of variable renewables. We've organized it in a way of looking at the phases, that at lower phases, the first initial, say, 10% of generation from wind and solar, tapping existing flexibility in the system is sufficient to integrate that output. Going higher, going towards 20% of generation requires more targeted investment, both from the network side, but also thinking about demand side response and storage. And that's already where some countries in the European Union are today. But we see going forward that everyone is going to higher shares of wind and solar. Everyone is moving to higher phases of integration, and that means more effort will be needed on the flexibility side. We've always needed flexibility. Demand has always changed, but now we're also seeing variability on the supply side. And that means the rest of the power system, all the other sources, more flexibility will be called on. Flexibility will be a more important part of power sector operations. That changes, as I mentioned, overall market design, market systems, and it affects the entire fleet. We're seeing that already, where energy sales used to be the dominant source of revenue. We're using the example of the European Union here, but this is also true in the United States and Australia, for example, where sales are a declining share of revenue. And we see this continuing with a rising share of wind and solar, continued lower prices for natural gas. And this changes the market that power plants are operating in. If you're not able to recover your costs through competitive markets, then flexibility or capacity mechanisms are more important to making you whole. And we see nuclear power plants certainly under this stress already today, as well as other types of power plants, but certainly affecting the economics of existing power plants. And I'm happy to go back to this, but I wanted to highlight that it's changing the economics of individual power plants and how we think of it. We've long looked at the levelized cost of electricity, but we should also recognize that the value proposition for technologies is also different. It depends on when and where you're able to provide power. Does that align with when the system needs it? Are you able to contribute to the reliability of the system and the flexibility in the system? For time, I won't belabor this, but I want to highlight that it makes the competitiveness analysis certainly more interesting, but also more complicated. You need to look well beyond the LCOE, and we've done that and introduced a new metric looking at the value-adjusted LCOE, where we're combining the LCOE, the levelized cost, and system value into a single metric, and that can give you some slightly different results than you would certainly get from an LCOE analysis. We use the example of China here, where we see solar PV closing the gap with coal in terms of competitiveness, if these lines match up, but you actually see the value-adjusted LCOE for solar PV go back up, and that's in part because it's not necessarily supplying electricity or energy at the times when you need it the most. If we overlay on top of that also other low-carbon technologies, including nuclear, we see that maybe the levelized cost could be quite different between, say, nuclear and solar PV, but in fact, they may be similarly competitive for the system. I'm happy to say more about that. And also, this makes it more challenging to displace the existing infrastructure, existing fossil fuels. We hear quite a lot about the cost of renewables approaching those of existing fossil fuels, but again, where they're providing different system value, that should be incorporated in the comparison. And the last point I want to highlight is on the policy importance going forward. We've mapped out, going region by region, technology by technology, how much of the $20 trillion in investment going forward would be through competitive markets, how much will be actually through regulations or tied to government decisions or directly state mandated, if you will. And the vast majority in the power sector will come through regulated or contracts where they're removing some of the risk. And this relates exactly back to the previous two figures, where the economics of power plants is becoming more challenging. We're seeing lower wholesale prices in general. So there's a massive role for governments going forward. And this is both good news, or depending on how you look at it, this also means that governments have both hands on the steering wheel, and they will need to choose where we go in terms of the clean energy transition and how fast. And maybe in the interest of time, I will skip this slide and I'll come back to it. Happy to come back to the question of where we explored a future where electricity is far more important. A key, I'll just highlight one point from it, is that we looked at if you tap the economic potential of electricity in all sectors and electrify faster. So we go to about 30% of electricity in total final consumption in this scenario by 2040. You can rely much heavier on electricity, but the starting question was, what does this get you in terms of how much does it change the overall energy mix, but also what does this do for CO2 emissions and others? You certainly have gains on air pollutants, but if you only electrify end uses without decarbonizing the power sector, without decarbonizing the power mix, both through renewables, but also nuclear and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, you see a very limited change in overall emissions. So we can't get to where we want to go with just electrifying end uses. Is the key point I'll highlight there. And then the last slide is on coming back to the sustainable development scenario. So where are we going in the new policy scenario? Even with all of this massive change, more investment in renewables, a continued role for nuclear, emissions worldwide across the energy sector continue to increase. We need to follow a very different pathway in order to follow achieve our sustainability goals. On the screen here, you also have the question of why is this so hard? Part of the reason is our existing infrastructure puts us on a particular path. The existing power plants, industry, facilities, building stock, they actually lock in a huge amount of our emissions. More than 90% of our emissions are locked in if we continue to operate them the way we have been. So we need to address that existing stock as well as what we're building. And I think that's a key point that also goes back to the role of existing nuclear is we need to continue operating that existing fleet so that we can reduce the emissions from the existing power plants that are also in place while we develop a host of clean energy technologies. To highlight that, you see the emission profile of existing coal-fired power plants without that type of intervention, where we need to reduce those emissions substantially, one way through perhaps carbon capture, utilization, and storage, but also through the deployment of renewables and additional deployment of nuclear power. So I'll conclude there, highlighting again that we see electricity being there's a huge opportunity, but there are challenges coming and changes coming. We need a comprehensive strategy to decarbonize electricity, and that goes beyond renewables to also include nuclear power and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And we should also look beyond electricity and decarbonizing heat and other applications. Decarbonizing transport, of course, will be critical to ultimately achieving our goals. There's no single solution. We should tap the suite of clean energy technologies, and ultimately, with both hands on the wheel, governments will play an important role in steering where we actually go. So with that, I will close. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brent, for that excellent presentation. I wanted to put out a quick reminder to our audience that you could submit questions. We've had a few coming in, and we would love to take as many as we can. And so now I will turn the time over to the Nuclear Energy Agency for their presentation.
Thank you, Jordan, and welcome to all the people listening in on the webinar. So thank you for giving us at the Nuclear Energy Agency the opportunity of adding a few words to the excellent presentation that Brent made. And thank you, Brent, for setting the scene for the future, which shows the important role of electricity in the decades to come, and the need also to switch to clean electricity. So the NEA is an agency within the OECD. We have 33 member countries representing in total about 82% of the world's installed nuclear capacity. So I'll start with an overview of what happened in 2018 which has been a relatively good year for nuclear compared to previous years. A record 10.4 gigawatts of new nuclear was connected to the grid last year. All of that happened in China and in Russia. And worth pointing was that the first 4 AP1000 reactors and the first EPR reactor, these are all Gen 3+ reactors, were connected to the grid in China. And that overall global connection rate was the highest in 30 years. There was also a new nuclear launched, 6.3 gigawatts. Quite strangely, I would say, the majority of that new build was in OECD countries. We had Korea and Turkey and UK starting their construction of new nuclear, and two other units in non-OECD countries. But we've also seen new projects cancelled, especially in the UK, projects that were carried by Japanese companies. Turkey also had a project cancelled, and the issues there were the costs of the new build, the financing conditions, as well as some other reasons. We've also seen the French government confirming the policy of reducing the share of nuclear from 75% today to 50% in 2030-35. So this will necessarily mean the closure of part of the fleet. On the good news, we've also seen initiatives to promote advanced reactors, especially in the US. A word on decarbonization, because this is a key policy goal for many countries. But we do see that very often policies are more directed at achieving deployment targets of selected technologies rather than at reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a question of technological neutrality of policies and their effectiveness. Today, there are very few support mechanisms for new nuclear, even though in the UK, the policies that the government put in place, the financing approaches do favor nuclear. But historically, and this is a chart from an IEA presentation from a few years ago, nuclear has been a very effective technology at reducing the carbon intensity of country's energy mix. And you see on the chart the example of Sweden, but France also realized similar reduction of carbon emissions. So what are the challenges for new nuclear? And we'll split the presentation in a few slides, and I'll let my colleague Antonio speak about long-term operation and new build. And then I'll come back on one of the key aspects that Brent underlined in his presentation, the need for flexibility. And I'll explain why nuclear can contribute to that flexibility. And I'll finish with some discussion on innovations for new nuclear.
Okay, so thank you, Henry. Now I would like to share with you some views, some ideas on the long-term operation of nuclear power plants. First of all, I'm going to talk about the technical aspects, and then I will give a focus on the economic aspects of long-term operation, and finally I have also one slide on the cost of new nuclear builds. So when talking about the technical aspects of long-term operation, we have to highlight that we already have extensive research and development, and also a real return of experience coming from existing nuclear power plants that prove that safe operation beyond the design lifetime of 40 years is already possible. Just to give some trends, in the US right now we have 91% of the fleet that has been already granted with license renewal. Then we have also in recently in Finland, Olkiluoto 1 and Olkiluoto 2 boiling water reactors, they also were granted and entered in extended operation lifetime in September. Then we also have more recent trends coming from Argentina and Balsas nuclear power plant, which is a kind of reactor that also is in extended operation, and we have experience and current plans in long-term operation in Belgium, in Switzerland, in Czech Republic. So just to show you some trends on what's happening on OECD member countries. Then what is important here is that most of the components of a nuclear power plant can be replaced. We have lifetime limiting components like the pressure vessel of the containment, but the rest can be replaced. And also we have put in place this regulatory framework, these age management programs that ensure that all these components are all the time monitored, inspected, and all components operate within the safety margins. And also I would like to share with you a more, let's say, dynamic image of a nuclear power plant. These are assets that are not static. And as I just told you, we have all these regulatory framework that allow that all these last safety standards are put in place. On we have here an image from the Spanish nuclear fleets, how the evolution of events. We can find similar trends in other countries, but the idea is we can see how even if apparently these nuclear power plants are aging, we see how they become more. They have less unexpected shutdowns. They are more reliable, and the overall safety is improved. And this is the main philosophy of the periodic safety reviews that are, let's say, the regulatory framework that is adopted in most of the member countries. Then just say that to support all this, in the US, we also have some recent trends showing that some utilities want to go even up to 80 years. There's really reduced technical uncertainty on this, according what the studies that the utilities have, and also recent research and development studies. And the idea is that the main, let's say, factor will be the economic one. The viability of the economic business case will finally condition if these nuclear power plants are operated up to 80 years and not the technical aspects. So if now we move to the economic part, we have to say that for sure, as Brent said, nuclear power plants, the competitiveness is being under pressure due to the penetration of high shares of renewables. In the US, the situation is worse due to the combined effect with cheap gas. But when compared with new nuclear builds, we can say that LTO investments face a lower overall risk due to the fact that they are less complex, and they have proved their feasibility over the last years that they have been implementing all over many nuclear power plants. And also they have reduced upfront costs. Just to give an order of magnitude, depends on the first of a kind project that we want to compare, but I would say that we are talking about investments of 4, even 5 or more orders of magnitude lower. So that's why nuclear long-term operation investments are gaining momentum over the past years. And this is what is shown in this chart from the World Energy Investment 2018. But however, having said that, we still need this political support to overcome market risk, to correct market flows, and also ensure that we have this long-term policy that gives sufficient visibility to recover these investments, and also to give the visibility which is needed to the supply chain. We have seen how by 2040 we may, let's say, huge low carbon capacity, nuclear capacity is at risk if nothing is done. So we need from the government this kind of recognition that the long-term operation is a way to maintain or even to help to reverse the trajectory of current emissions, that CO2 emissions that increased in 2018. Now, if we move to the cost of new builds, the first thing that we have to say is that nuclear power, nuclear new builds, as all low carbon technologies, is a capital intensive activity, but also have other as other low carbon assets, they also can take advantage of the basic laws of economics, that such as economies of scale or learning effects, and cost can be effectively reduced if the good conditions are put in place, and we have historical data supporting that, and also more successful current nuclear programs that show these trends and confirm these trends. The cost overruns and time delays that we have recently observed in the nuclear sector are mainly due to first-of-a-kind projects, but after this phase, new nuclear builds could enter in a learning phase, which may be driven principally by the fact of having a proven and frozen design, and a standard design that could be then, let's say, deployed in a massive way with a steady, let's say, inflow of new projects. But because this is also really important, I have just said that nuclear is a capital-intensive activity, but also a knowledge-intensive activity, and we need to nourish the skills to keep this to, let's say, release all and capitalize on the effects of learning effects. And then for sure, all of this under the umbrella of a regulatory stability that does not change during the construction time. So if all these ingredients are put in place, we can effectively reduce cost of nuclear power plants. And this is what happened, for instance, in Korea. And this is what I wanted to show you here. This chart shows the evolution of the overnight construction cost over time in Korea. We can see how bubbles get bigger, suggesting that we have economies of scale, but also the cost is reduced. The idea is that they use the same standard design, and also just know that I don't know if you can see that, but we have these bubbles that are somehow coupled. The idea is they also use what is called the multi-uni effect, which is a really effective way to reduce cost of building nuclear power plants, several at the same time on the same site, so that you can spread out fixed costs among multiple nuclear power plants. And just to finish, we just mentioned the opportunities related to overnight construction costs, but we also have financing costs there, and that's why the government may play an important role in implementing this policy framework to ensure the access of the funding, but also reduce overall risk of the project. For instance, if governments bear part of the risk of these projects. And now I give the floor to Henri, just to show how nuclear is a flexible and no carbon energy source.
Yes, thank you, Antonio. So, as was presented by Brent, there is a need for flexibility in future generation systems, and that includes the power plants, the grids, and energy storage systems. Now, very often, gas is presented as the natural partner of variable renewables, and for sure gas has a lot of attractive features. It's very flexible, has high ramping rates, but we have to keep in mind that it is not a low carbon source of power. It's cleaner than coal, but it's not a low carbon technology. In terms of ramping rates, the chart on the lower right part of the slide shows that actually nuclear has a very significant flexibility and compares very well with gas, as well as very high ramping rates. This is not necessarily known because it's not in place or in operation in many countries, but today there is already a long proven experience of nuclear providing flexibility to the power systems. In France, in Germany, and increasingly in the US, there is a transition towards flexible operation of nuclear power plants. This is to follow load, but also to provide a number of grid services and frequency response services. But this definition of flexibility in terms of operation can go much further for nuclear, and there are many ways in which nuclear can contribute to future energy systems. Nuclear can contribute to energy storage. So I'm citing an example which is a historic example that is actually no longer very relevant because of the way the electricity markets work. But for decades, Swiss hydro plants were pumping water at night, buying cheap nuclear electricity, and then selling hydroelectricity at daytime and making a profit. Well, today with the advent of solar power, actually the spread between the night and the midday costs is not that large that this practice can cover the costs. But it is I would say a good example. There's also a possibility for nuclear to enter the non-electric markets and to decarbonize other sectors. It is very important, of course, that nuclear play its full role in decarbonizing the power sector, but there are other sectors where we should take advantage of the fact that nuclear provides low carbon heat as well. So district heating is also a proven example, not spread very much around the world, but we have experience, for example, in Switzerland of over 35-year operation of district heating from the Besnau nuclear power plant, supplying heating and hot water to local communities. Desalination is a very energy-intensive process. Today, most processes use oil or gas, so they're emitting a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. But nuclear heat and electricity could be used to make this a low carbon process. Then providing process heat, steam, high temperature steam for industry, and hydrogen production. These are areas that have been the object of a lot of research, especially in the countries developing generation 4 systems, like the very high temperature reactors. And we see a renewed interest in the use of hydrogen as an energy vector for transport applications, and nuclear production of hydrogen may become more and more interesting and attractive. Of course, combining the possibility of nuclear power plants generating electricity and also non-electric products such as hydrogen. This is the basis of the development of so-called hybrid energy systems, which are also an important part of the work that the Nice Future initiative is following. Looking more to the future at innovations, so advanced reactors can provide a lot of the new applications that I've just mentioned. Small modular reactors, they offer, in addition to, I would say, the flexibility of the large light water reactors, they offer deployment flexibility because of the ability to scale the deployment. They offer more opportunities for siting. They offer increased operational flexibility. Looking at higher temperatures than Gen 4 reactors, especially the non-light water reactor Gen 4 reactors, offer the ability of using various fuels, even closing the fuel cycle. Higher temperature meaning high efficiency, and both SMRs and Gen 4 reactors target electric and non-electric markets. So the key message that we want to say that don't forget that low carbon, that nuclear is a low carbon source of electricity and heat. And when you're looking at the heat market, there aren't a lot of competitors for nuclear. There is for sure CCS, biomass to a certain extent, but there's a limit to how much biomass you can burn. But there's not a lot of other technologies that can provide heat without emissions. So we do believe that flexibility is key for the future power markets, but it's also key for the future energy systems when you look at electricity and the heat sector, the transport sector together. Just a few words on Nice Future, the Nice Future initiative. It's a very, very good idea to have launched this initiative last year. It's an important forum to discuss the attributes of nuclear, among other clean energy sources, and I hope this webinar will have provided this opportunity. And I'll finish by listing or drawing your attention to a few reports that we've produced. At the NEA, we had a report last year on the full cost of electricity provision, and we're releasing this week a new report that draws or develops the analysis of what Brent described in his presentation, the system costs that appear when you're having high shares of renewables in a system. And so this study looks at the costs of decarbonizing in these contexts. At the NEA, we're supporting two international initiatives, the Gen4 International Forum. Last year in October, we had a symposium, and I draw your attention to the symposium. We will be publishing the proceedings of that, but there are a number of keynote presentations that are available on the website that are very interesting. And we're also providing support to the International Forum for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, IFNEC. We partnered with Nice Future last November in Japan and organized a conference on the challenges and opportunities facing nuclear energy. There are a number of very interesting papers that were presented at that conference, and we'll be publishing a summary report this year. And a save the date also for those that have interest in small modular reactors and advanced nuclear. We'll organize this year in November in Washington, D.C., an international summit on SMRs and advanced reactors. So with that, I would close our presentation. Thank the organizers for having given us the opportunity to share a little bit of our work, and be happy to take questions as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our presenters today who did just such an excellent job. We had a lot of questions come in, and so I'm going to do my best to get to all of them. The first couple of questions I wanted to ask from our participants were involving everyone. So feel free, all of our presenters, feel free to answer these. And then the first one is, which technologies do you see having the largest impact in developing countries?
Thanks for the question, Jordan. Maybe I'll jump in there if I could. Sure. So, I mean, a lot of the work, particularly we have a clean energy transition program looking at working with developing economies and how moving them forward on a clean energy transition. And certainly, I think it can't be overstated the importance of the decline in renewable technologies, the decline in the cost of renewable technologies, solar PV in particular, but also wind power, and also now offshore wind power also developing. In the discussions there, we see certainly an openness to various technologies across the clean energy, the suite of clean energy technologies. But I think the speed at which you can build renewables, the declining costs are certainly making them very important for the clean energy transition. Now that said, they're very reliant still on fossil fuels. Many have domestic sources of coal, potentially gas, and so there is a domestic industry issue fixed against this. And I leave nuclear aside. I think there's interest. There's certainly interest in nuclear, but I think it's also relevant to think of the longer timelines to develop a nuclear industry and the challenges of doing that, of having the regulatory structure in place, along with the safety regimes. And so it takes more time to build up the capabilities. But of course, if you include in this China and India, we're seeing very vibrant nuclear industries that are expanding. So certainly, and others watching to see that new nuclear projects can be developed on time and on budget, and then certainly it would be part of an interesting package.
For nuclear, I would say certainly large nuclear power plants have a maybe better cost advantage in terms of levelized cost of electricity, but the overall investment being much smaller. I think the small modular reactors at least once they've been proven, so deployed in a country that is designing and building them, would be an attractive solution for developing countries. But we need to have two steps. One that Brent mentioned, so the fact that a country interested in nuclear has to put in place an infrastructure, a regulator, and so on. And then the other challenge is to demonstrate that small modular reactors can be built sufficiently fast and within the cost of their designs. So that's a possibility for developing countries.
Thank you very much for those answers. The next question we have for the entire group, all the panelists, is that all of the presentations had a very large or very central component talking about policy. What are some of the policies that your organizations would advocate for or be interested in studying more?
Certainly, I'll jump in there as well if I could. I mean, very much we see policies being a key driver for the deployment of really any clean energy technology at this stage. We have increasing use of auction schemes, reverse auction schemes on the renewables side, but this wouldn't be appropriate for nuclear development technologies. But a common theme among those policies is providing some level of revenue guarantee or reducing the risk for developers and for those clean energy technologies in terms of revenues. So providing some level of revenue guarantee, you see this in a variety of forms, from contract for difference in the United Kingdom to complete sort of buyback or power purchase agreements in the long term, establishing a clear rate. I think that de-risking of these are all very capital intensive investments. And if you can reduce the risk, you can lower the financing costs, and that lowers the cost of the overall transition. That would be the primary thing I would point to in terms of policies that we're advocating.
And from the NEA point of view, one policy that we've been advocating for a number of years is to have a level playing field for all low carbon technologies, to provide the same type of support schemes for new nuclear that have been provided in the past for other low carbon technologies. Very often we see that nuclear is treated in a specific way or a special way. In the EU, for instance, there are directives related to renewables that don't apply to new nuclear, for instance. So having a level playing field for decarbonization policies would be a step forward. And Antonio?
Yes, I also would like to add something. It's very interesting what Brent also showed. We have this cost structure, but also we have the value on the system. And also it will be interesting to have policies that engage all these low carbon resources, but also recognize the attributes that they have to support and remunerate the value. And this is also what I would like to ask in terms of capacity, in terms of flexibility.
Thank you. So we now have about 2 minutes left in the webinar. So I have 2 questions that I'll go through very quickly. The first one is specifically for Brent from the World Energy Outlook report. In your World Energy Outlook analysis, what were some of the variables that produced the most drastic change? You talked a lot about electricity storage and nuclear and low nuclear prices or nuclear innovation. What were some of the things that changed the outlook most significantly?
Sure. Thanks very much for the question as well. I think we've talked a lot about policy, but that is really the key driver for change from one outlook to the next. We are part of the reason we identify multiple scenarios is to identify the clear gap between where we are headed and where we would like to go. And so each year we hopefully see new policies that are pushing the expansion of clean energy technologies and accelerating that transition. So those are ultimately, I mean, if we look back historically, for example, China's solar PV deployment has been the product of policy changes. If you go back to 2008, for the year 2020, they were targeting 2 gigawatts of solar PV. Last year, they deployed 44 gigawatts in 2018. So that's the direct result of policy changes. So certainly that's why we track and talk about policy so much.
Thank you. And then a final question for the NEA. I guess, according to your analysis, what are some of the worst case scenarios where we don't see nuclear innovation and we also see plant closures? And how does that affect the overall greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, if we have a closure of the existing fleet at, let's say, 40 years of age, as Brent showed in one of his slides, we have a dramatic fall in capacity, and I don't see this being replaced by just renewables. So necessarily there will be a replacement by probably gas, and so an overall increase in CO2 emissions, and that's one point that we need policy makers and governments to realize, is that the existing fleet plays an important role in ensuring or maintaining low carbon generation capacity, and closing it too early before it can be replaced by other low carbon sources will necessarily lead to emissions increase.
All right. I'd like to once again extend a thank you to all of our experts and to all the people who attended and submitted questions. If your question was not asked, we are planning on following up with the experts to try and get that question answered, and we will email you. I also wanted to point out that we will have a replay link of this webinar available in the next few days, and we will be sending that out to you. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at nice future events. This concludes our webinar.